Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are about to start the last, but of course not least, the part of our conference, which is devoted to film as a specific tool for shaping collective memory. I have a great pleasure to introduce our special guest, Constantin Parvulescu, who writes on the audiovisual representation of financial services, but also about the cinema of Eastern Europe and general of film and about film and history. He is also the editor of the Global Finance on Screen. The title of the publication is like that, Global Finance on Screen, From Wall Street to Side Street, which appeared quite recently. He is also the author of Orphans and the East, Post-War Eastern European Cinema and the Revolutionary Subject, which came out 2 years ago, and co-editor of a companion to the historical film. Presently, he is a research fellow at the Institute for Culture and Society, University of Navarra, and guest lecturer at the University of St. Gallen. Constantin, the floor is yours, please.
But okay, okay, thank you. I will stand because I want to synchronize a bit my talk with the PowerPoint presentation. Thank you very much for inviting me here, for having me, for witnessing this very interesting conference, and especially today, much more for us as people from the audiovisual media and the great keynotes, and also thank you for taking good care of me, like taking me with taxis and dinners, and thank you very much for everything. While I was waiting here, of course, I was looking at my own title, and I was asking myself, so what is the business I am in? And first, of course, I would say that I am in the business of commenting on the political imaginary of small nations of East Central Europe. So that would be one, especially in the contemporary era. And the second would be probably my concern with, or I would be more like a janitorial business, you know, like cleaning up. So what I want to say by this is that anti-communist discourse has unfortunately negatively influenced the way in which, or has biased the way in which we think or we remember socialism. And I understand myself and many people I work with in this business of trying to clean up of what anti-communist discourse has produced, a bit of mess. And I think my talk will address these issues. There's another premise of my talk that I want to point out. It's that the cultural production of small communities, ethnic communities, national communities, communities of faith, communities of value, communities of sexual orientation. So this cultural production is much more informed or visibly invested with mnemonic and defensive function than, let's say, the big other, which are the larger cultures. Right. The simplest explanation for that is, of course, that the political imaginaries of these cultures are marked by grand anti-imperialist narratives. So narratives of endangerment and calls to defend their threatened core and often essentialized practices. These cultures respond to the call to serve collective remembering and identity. For example, the cinema of the Basque Country, where I happen to live right now, is such a typical example of mix of militancy, canonizing traditions, and memorial performance. But I will talk about East Central Europe. So no worry. So this explanation, of course, applies as well to the small national cultures of East Central Europe. Anti-imperialist narratives of danger crisscross these cultures and alter their output since the 19th or perhaps 18th century. They activate consciousness, even in our days, in which I think, and I think with thinkers like Antonio Negri or Michael Hart, that we live in a post-imperialist, or at least in Europe, we live in a post-imperialist context, in which, and also in a context in which Europe, or at least in the last 50, 60 years, Europe has been, with the exception of some traumatic events that have been addressed in the previous panel, we lived in a very peaceful and prosperous times in Europe. So the activate, this presentation aims to examine the work of East Central multi-awarded Cristian Mungiu, director Cristian Mungiu, and I aim to reveal how his work, as you saw probably in the title, I aim to reveal how his work proposes a critical approach to the discourse of endangerment and urgent defense, which is, let's say, the paradigm of, emotional paradigm of anti-imperialist discourse, marking East Central Europe's political imaginary. So the first part of this talk will address the discourse of endangerment. The second shows how the work of Mungiu addresses it and how it invites viewers to rethink endangerment. And since we talk about the endangerment of small nations of East Central Europe, of course, one of the paradigmatic texts that addresses it is Milan Kundera's The Tragedy of Central Europe. For Kundera, the situation of being East Central European is strongly informed by the memory and fear of superpower imperialist abuse. The very, and I quote, existence of a small culture may be put in question at any moment, as these cultures are, I quote, one gesture away from losing it all, end quote. The fact that these cultures constantly call for external aid shows that they are, and again I quote from Kundera, fragile beyond repair. So this is a very brief summary of Kundera's point. In this predicament of endangerment, small East and Central European cultures produce in a state of urgency, and their output includes calls for protection and alliances. In the times when Kundera wrote his essay, which was 1987, so it was still during the times of socialism, this protector was Europe, the enemy, of course, Soviet Russia. Another grand alliance he had in mind was of the United States of Central Europe. 30 years, and I'm talking about now, 30 years after the writing of his manifesto, however, the new populist nationalisms that have grown in East Central Europe no longer share Kundera's pro-Europeanism, or even his pro-Central Europeanism, and we can talk about that. In their narratives of endangerment, the EU plays the role, or Europe plays the role of the villain and the imperialist superpower. Now, this was more, say, the historical political context. Now, to come back to cinema and its role and its performance of memory within these coordinates that I have defined before. So cinema is an important narrative of apparatus of collective memory. Given its dramatic storytelling structure, it performs memory in formats of endangerment, of rescue, which are, of course, typical of the dramatic storytelling, urgency and calls for help. And we should keep that in mind. Narrative storytelling is populated with antagonists, helper, and fake friends, as well as with multiple situations of danger, entrapment, exploitation, and, of course, rescue. East Central national cultures performing their memory within these coordinates, yeah, have used the storytelling structure and the rhetoric of cinematic storytelling to construct their national mythology. Of course, this practice is obvious if one takes a look, and we're talking about more specifically about cinema, this practice is obvious if one takes a look at the history of film production in the East Central European area. The first feature film made on Romanian soil, for example, was a historical film titled significantly The War of Independence, which you see here, immortalizing an important historical aspect in the modern Romanian history and, of course, a very important trope within the Romanian nationalist discourse. The same can be said about 1947, and after the Soviet-style communist turn of Romania, and when the modern Romanian feature film was born. The first feature film produced in the modern Romanian film industry bears the title The Valley Resounds, and it is as well the documentation of a national mobilization. One could go even further with this argument and reflect on why the two original genres of Balkan film, so the contribution of Balkan film to, let's say, the history of world cinema, the genres are, according to historian Marian Tsutsui, the bandit or the Haiduk films on the one hand, and on the other, the partisan films. Both are subspecies of the genre we might call small nation national mythology film. The first provides a narrative defense of the abused rural peasantry, the core bearer of the national traditions according to officially sanctioned nationalist discourse. The second remembers national defense against the grand imperial superpower of the first half of the 20th century, Nazi Germany. Mungiu's most important films, which you have here, the posters of them, and I will talk about these three films in particular. 4 months, 3 weeks and 2 days, the first. Beyond the Hills, the second, and the third, Graduation, also in the order of their making, are critical commentaries against these narrative logics. And I think this is why the work of Mungiu deserves to be awarded and re-awarded at grand festivals such as Cannes. His work indicates that this type of storytelling produces, and this is my reading of his films, and I think his contribution, or our contribution, his work indicates that this type of storytelling that I was mentioning before produces what cultural theorist Laurent Berland calls cruel optimism. And I will say a few words about this. So Berland defines cruel optimism as attachment, I quote, no, it's not a quote, but it's almost like a quote. So it's an attachment to compromised conditions of possibility. It is an investment of desire in an object or a narrative that, at a certain moment in time, becomes an impediment to the aim whose achievement it was supposed to serve. The situation can be even worse. Instead of liberating, the narrative, or the enactment of the narrative, turns into a means of oppression. For Berland, cruel optimism is associated with promises and visions of a good or better life, which are fulfilled at a price that is too high. For example, the narrative of cruel optimism informed the desire to purify ethnic groups in the former Yugoslavia and its consequences. The same can be said about the new... I want to say something about nationalism today in Poland. Mark my words. Right. All right. Perfect. All right. So, give me a sec. The same can be said about the new nationalism of East Central Europe, than the price citizens of Hungary or Poland pay today for their desire to put real Hungarians or real Poles into power. Mungiu's commentary is inspired by, I argue, a historical event that brings the cultures of East Central Europe into post-modernity and into the post-imperialist world. And this historical moment that inspires him is 1989. And I think his acts, the critical commentary of his work, is an act of fidelity in the sense it was defined by Alain Badiou, fidelity to the event of 1989. This event shapes the memory of the generation to which Mungiu and perhaps many of the people here in the room belong to. But as we shall see, Mungiu is faithful to it in a very particular way. Staying faithful to 1989 can interrupt the self-oppressing narratives of cruel optimism that I was mentioning before, that perpetuate the condition of being fragile beyond repair, as Kundera was using the phrase, which, of course, we use the phrase with reference to East Central Europe. Let us first see how the films portray the fragile. And I use the short, like 432 is the shortcut for 4 months, 3 weeks, okay, and then BTH is for Beyond the Hills, and Grad is for Graduation, so the 3 films that, so let us see how they comment on the condition of being fragile, help demanding condition of being small and exposed to violence as modeled in Kundera's essay. As feminist film scholar Jane Gaines argues, Mungiu's films rely on a predictable melodrama trope to a certain extent. They feature a female vulnerable protagonist or pair of protagonists that seek the help of a patriarchal agent. Mungiu's melodramas don't have happy endings, as the helper abuses them. Abuse comes in the form of rape, rape attempt, child molestation, unwanted pregnancies, patriarchalism in general, and exploitative social and political predicament. Each of his films includes in its opening sequences a metaphor of the condition of vulnerability and of being small. 432, for 4 months, 3 weeks, 2 days, starts with a close-up of a fish tank, and the way protagonists asking, and shows how protagonists are asking what will happen to the fish while they're going to be away for a few days. In Graduation, a rock breaks the window of the protagonist's apartment in the beginning of the film. Later, the windshield of her car is smashed by an unknown perpetrator. In Beyond the Hills, the protagonists in the beginning of the film are shown on a narrow platform between overpowering moving trains. Let us take a look, this is the image, yeah, so let us take a look at, let's take a look at the focus of the films. They all thematize help. So it's not only that you have helpers in the film, which would be normal to the narrative structure, but they focus and they thematize help. All three have reflexive endings, and they also have reflexive endings in which characters reflect on how the patriarchal helper has turned into oppressor. And with the characters, of course, we reflect as viewers as well. The long and mournful endings of 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days, and Beyond the Hills, call on viewers to reflect on the consequences of this turn in terms of cruel optimism, and on the unacceptable high price the vulnerable pay for their hopes to overcome their condition with the help of the powerful. Let us take a look at the narrative construction of the films. As in classical cinematic three-act narrative, the moments of cruel occur in the second act of the film. The protagonist realizes that friends have turned into foes, new and true helpers appear, and goals are needed to be reformulated. Unlike this classical three-act drama, Mungiu's films do not include a second act awakening and reformulation of goals. The initial goal and the plan to achieve the goal do not change until the end. His films just show how helpers turn gradually into abusers and how the protagonists adapt and struggle to survive this tragic situation. And the film stops there. In 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days, 2 women invest their hope of rescue from an unwanted pregnancy into an illegal abortion. The procedure has to be carried out in grand urgency because, as the title of the film indicates, the pregnancy is already mature. The helper turning oppressor is the abortionist. His intervention saves one of the girls from her pregnancy and subsequent social marginalization by having an unwanted child. But the price is high. They have to sleep with him, both. In Beyond the Hill, the helper turned oppressor is Christian orthodoxy, embodied by the patriarchal figure of the priest. The protagonists, 2 young women, seek to overcome their helpless social and economic situation in the radical religious practices of life in a monastery. Religion is expected to save them from their troubled past, which includes abandonment in an orphanage, sexual molestation, poverty, and homosexual, and thus socially unacceptable, sexual relations. The price for this protection and purification within the monastery is, of course, high. It culminates in a religious exorcism, and that proves to be traumatic and kills one of the young women and might send the other one to jail. Graduation's approach is slightly different. It focuses more on the psychology of the helper. The helper is the father of a young woman who is sexually molested in the eve of her graduation exam. The more the father tries to protect his daughter and help her pass this very important final exam, the more he turns into an oppressor, jeopardizing her mental health and her academic career. Mungiu's films include 2 other tropes gesturing toward cruel optimism and narratives of abuse, narratives of urgency and rescue. An example of the first is the rock that I was mentioning about breaks the window of the protagonist in the beginning of graduation. The trope suggests that abuse against the unprotected is structural, and I will emphasize this, structural. It is not to be related to a particular situation or perpetrator. The thriller atmosphere of Mungiu's films adds to this cinematic construction of structural violence. The thriller, in graduation, the sexual molester and the person who breaks the window are never identified. The film tellingly includes a scene, which you can see here, includes a scene in which there is an effort to put a face or a name to or a subjective reason to what I would call structural violence. And of course, you can realize I'm playing with concepts by Slavoj Žižek, who opposes structural violence to what he calls subjective violence, violence associated to a certain person or a certain agent. Right? The identification, of course, fails. We don't know who the perpetrator is. All 3 films also, as another argument to this, also include 1 or more scenes in which the protagonist unsuccessfully tries to find something or escape an off-screen threat. They are usually night scenes, And you can see, as you can see here in the picture, one of the protagonists runs away from something or someone whose identity remains unknown. Associated with this unseen threat are emotions such as fear, powerlessness, entrapment, frustration, and embarrassment. The emotional landscape is, however, muted. The films don't seek to exploit dread or outrage. They focus on the condition. Characters seem to be used to function under stress, fear, and oppression. This imminent sense of danger and stress is augmented by the choice of uncanny camera angles, especially in 432, and the use of a slightly trembling handheld camera. The second indicator of Mungiu's interest to show the cruel optimism of narratives of liberation is the inclusion in his films of references to past abuses and even to future ones. And this is an important suggestion because by this, he indicates that abuse is cyclical within these narratives of help and rescue. The protagonists of 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days had sexual relations before the abortion, had sexual relations with men who exposed them to unwanted pregnancies in a context that severely punishes abortion. That was Romania of the 80s. The protagonists of Beyond the Hill share a past of sexual molestation as children growing up in the orphanage. Graduation includes references which focuses a bit more on the perpetrator. Graduation includes references, I wouldn't say perpetrator, I would say helper, let's keep it this way, includes references to the father having helped abuse relationships to other women than his daughter in his past, of course one of them being the mother of the daughter. From this point of view, the plot of these 3 films, so the plots develop as an attempt to fix the harm that has been done in the past. That's where the invocation of the helper. The procedure leads, however, in the logic of cruel optimism, to further abuse. The young women with unwanted pregnancies are raped. The sexually aggressed high school girl of graduation is further distressed by her father, who wants to provide appropriate help for his daughter after failing his wife. In graduation even includes a reference to the future. The father will leave his wife and take care of his present lover and her child. These examples gesture toward vicious cycle of abuse related to the situation of being small. Mungiu's films provide a suggestion as to how to exit this cycle. And here is this critical commentary. This cultural strategy also shows, as I was mentioning before, his faithfulness to the 1989 event. The ending of his films are the sequences that articulate most clearly this message of faithfulness and of critical reflection. And this is the ending of 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. So the endings of all films develop moments of long silence, eerie ambivalence, and non-action. There are moments in which characters remember and reflect on how help turned into abuse, on how their situation has become unacceptable. Going back to Lauren Berlant, she calls these situations situations of impasse. She calls these situations of impasse. A character realizes that he or she cannot move forward in the given conditions. This would be the definition of impasse that Lauren Berlant gives. Impasse is a moment of hovering, of disengagement, expectation, reflection, and openness to an event. The endings of the films set the emotional and intellectual context in which memory is to be performed by the vulnerable. Impasse indicates that what truly needs to change is the way things change. Powerlessness gains another dimension as it is redefined as dependence, if not addiction, to certain narratives of rescue articulated in moments of urgency, and small as well. Impasse means reflection on this condition and refusing to continue participating in the circle of abuse. The final scenes of Mungiu's films are invitations to remember not only the past, but the narrative formats in which the past is produced. Mungiu's political statement can be thus found in the way in which he makes use of time in these endings, in these ending sequences. The closing sequences of 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days, and beyond the hills provide, as I was mentioning, minutes of inaction. As a political statement faithful to 1989, this use of duration articulates a call to prolong the situation of hovering as much as possible. This is Mungiu's cinematic revisitation of 1989, performed in these scenes as a pivotal moment of self-determination and in definition, so in definition with a hyphen, in the history of small East Central European cultures, whose hovering, post, let's say, beyond 1989, has been cut short, very short, by narrative of urgent relief, such as anti-communism or nationalism. And I arrive here to the conclusion of my essay, and I hope I can bring everything together. I apologize if it's a bit sketchy, but there are some time limits. Graduation ends by articulating a commentary on memory. This is the final shot of graduation. So it ends by articulating a commentary on memory. At the graduation ceremony, the daughter asks her father to take a souvenir photo of her and her classmates. She also tells him she has not followed his advice on an important issue. She has not listened to one of his suggestions. So in this final shot, also marks her disobedience and her moment of emancipation from her controlling father. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll go back. Just give me a sec. The core of Mungiu's perceptive message on memory and on the political imaginary of East Central Europe is to be found here. Narrative performances of memory of small East European cultures, as well as scenarios of cultural emancipation, can, and perhaps should, according to Mungiu, they can or should be articulated differently, abandoning the format of danger and imperialist threat and prolonging the hovering. The protagonists of 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days, or beyond the hill, might remain fragile beyond repair. But the more optimistic ending of graduation suggests that the daughter can overcome on her own. Her generation can deploy acts of memory, and the political imaginary of this generation is differently structured. And the acts of memory that it produces can be structured in different narrative formats, relieved of the small cultural concerns and grand narratives of anti-imperialism one finds in the text that I mentioned at the beginning of Milan Kundera. For Mungiu, the difference is made by performing an act of fidelity to 1989, Mungiu professes disengagement as a mode of staying faithful to it. Interruption is the deconstruction of narratives of fear. In the case of East Central Europe, these narratives of fear are articulated against imperialist danger. Of course, I don't have time here to develop this argument, but in 1989, it's mainly linked to thinking the past in post-imperialist frameworks. In terms of memory practice, impasse, as defined by Berlin, translates into a cultural practice of constant revisiting of this legacy and broadening its historical opening. It refers to overcoming urgency and fear and calls for rescue. It suggests that narrating the past and the present in terms of Kundera's essays prepares the terrain for perpetuating cycles of abuse, like nationalism, like nationalist populism, the rise of disproportionate conservatism and xenophobia in East Central Europe, which are all articulated as narratives of abuse, or narrative of rescue, and all these seem to be the new liberating discourses in East Central Europe. And according to the logic of Laurent Berlin and the Christian Mungiu's films, these will lead to the second half of the second act and the third act, and all these narrative of rescue from this imperial danger will lead to further abuse. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I must admit that I've seen only one of those films. I mean, 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. And the optimism about you were talking in this film is so cruel. It is almost impossible to bear with. Time for questions and comments.
Thank you for your very interesting commentary. I want to say that we have presented Mungiu films in our European Solidarity Center, and to the great applause of the audience. But I have a question about your interpretation that it's, especially Graduation, that it's a film about being faithful to the legacy of 1989. How do you mean? Because from Polish perspective, you might have thought that the film is very much in line with Polish films of the 1970s, of the so-called moral anxiety cinema, like Agnieszka Holland, like Kieślowski. It's a kind of film they could have made back then. And although it applies to the modern society, I do realize that. Yet the problems depicted, you know, the question whether you should be rather honest, it's also in Zanussi's films of that period of time, whether you should be honest to yourself, you know, be honest during the exam, and then whether you should stay in the country or rather go to study abroad. Those all seem not to be the questions of 1989. How do you relate it to the legacy of that period? It seems to be almost absent from my perspective from Mungiu films. Thank you.
I think it's a good question, and it probably points out to the fact that, given time restraints, maybe I have not elaborated sufficiently what it means to be faithful to the 1989 event. To answer the first part of your question, of course, there are various traditions in Eastern European cinema. And of course, Mungiu or whoever is within this tradition, I am sure he or she has been influenced by them, has been in dialogue with them, and they are all very interesting interpretations. This is not necessarily my interpretation, but I could see someone writing a very insightful essay on what you have pointed out. So, excellent point. Now to go back to the 1989, the point about 1989, the way we understand it, is about not thinking in imperialist terms. Many of the stories about 1989 are stories of implosion. They are not stories that, how should I say, they already show that the giant was very weak. And so they point out to the fact that Europe, living in Europe today, you are no longer a nation that is in danger. And if you are using narratives of danger, like danger from the immigrants, like danger of corrupted Hungarians or corrupted Romanians that are not in power, you are just reusing a narrative of abuse. And 1989 is being faithful to 1989 is being faithful of interrupting these type of narratives and reminding cultures of East Central Europe that they no longer live in this post-imperialist time. That they don't longer live. We don't live in imperialist times. Okay, well, at least not in Europe, right? And that this is now a form, you can say narrative abuse, or you can say political manipulation, right?
Yes, we have next question.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question about this term cruel optimism, and I'm wondering if optimism isn't too harsh of a word. I mean, I watched only one of those movies, but shouldn't the word to describe them be more balanced in a way?
That's a good point. Especially because they're very sad films, right? And there's so much has been written on them, on the idea of hopelessness, right? So that they emanate hopelessness. Though the only one that emanates some degree of hope is graduation. Of course, I have not invented the concept of cruel optimism, and the way even Lauren Bernard uses it, she says she talks about when she applies it to film analysis, she talks about La Promesse, a film by the Dardenne brothers. And believe me, the Dardenne brothers films are not optimistic films, right? So I think it's like a recommendation, don't take it so literally. Just this was her concept, and I think it is relevant because it shows the way in which the helper who comes to give. So for explaining these films, it is a very useful concept, and of course we have to acknowledge the work of others before us. So I could have changed it, but I mean, it's still her merit from this point of view. So it's a functional concept that you have to use it.
So, if I may, for a moment, what strikes me a lot, it's a similarity of the narrative structure you described in your lecture to the well-known kind of psychological therapy, which is called dramatic triangle. And the figure of dramatic triangle, it consists of exactly of these three figures. I mean, helper, oppressor, and a victim. And the crucial thing is very similar, again, because this change, helper into oppressor, oppressor into a victim, victim into a helper, is a core of this therapy of this psychological idea. And the optimistic moment in this therapy is breaking this triangle. just stop this constant change or exchange of roles. So, and not only danger is very important in this case, but also revenge. So my question is, was it any relationships between some kinds of psychological therapy and the narrative structure of those films? Maybe some inspirations, relations? Can you comment on this?
That's a very that's a very pleasant surprise that you have mentioned therapy, and in the sense your question is about the way in which you have the feeling that there is a therapeutic scenario within the films. Yes. No? Yes.
Maybe.
Yeah.
This is, let's say, one part of the question, but the second is rather simple about some relationship between authors' intentions and let's say psychological inspirations.
Right. So far, I think I'm very happy that you mentioned this, because it shows that there is a trans-discursive relevance of these narratives of cruel optimism and therapy and abuse. So from that point of view, I thank you very much for the comment. To tell you very specifically about Cristian Mungiu, I have read many interviews by him with regard to these films. But as far as I know, maybe other people have too, I have not encountered any reference to therapy. The reference he usually makes are references to, remembering the socialist period, kind of references to the way in which the social period informs the post-1989 era, and how the past kind of seeps into the present, and seeps into the present as I was trying to demonstrate here, in forms of narrating, in forms of remembering, so more structural aspects. So that's all I can say, unfortunately, on this. But again, I think it's a very interesting comment. It makes me very happy to hear it.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I would like to ask you for help to define the historical situation in 1989, because in this year, it's worth to remind, 3 priests connected with the opposition were murdered, were killed by security forces, 1989. That's why I would like to ask, was then the communism or a socialism in Poland? It's connected with, my question is connected with your introduction, when you said that anti-communism is an obstacle to understand socialism. And I wonder if you had socialism then in Poland in 1989 or communism. Thank you.
That's a very tricky commentary, and it's a tricky question, because sometimes it is the effort to use, for example, communism or socialism already puts you in a certain ideological camp, or maybe already shows that you are, let's say, part of. And as you probably know, I've been in this field for many years of Eastern European cinema. In the 90s, it was all communism. It was the term that was mostly used. Now, if you read the literature, it's more socialism. And it's very interesting how it changes. And it changes because I think when people abandon the word communism, why would they abandon it? Okay, it's a very complicated question, but I would just say, well, why would you abandon the word communism? Well, you abandon the word communism because, for many reasons. First of all, it was a socialist republic, number one. Number two, it was only socialism. They didn't make it to communism, right? So that's the second one. The third one is because communism was so fully mouthly used by the American propaganda that you would think that maybe it's better to try to relativize it a bit. And people who have used socialism instead of communism, they did it because they tried not to resonate, not to sound like the voice or the sound like they were the agents of Ronald Reagan or, I don't know, Cold War propaganda, right? So from that point of view, I think, and the list is much longer, and I don't want to bore you here, why people have used. Then there was another effort to use like real existing socialism, which was, of course, was a little too long and a little ridiculous. So then we use state socialism. So if you are, and you probably, like historians, I think as well, if you are in this business for a while, you see these concepts like coming and going, and we wonder what's probably the most appropriate to use. I think for probably state socialism would be a good one, as it's a bit longer. Socialism will be good as well. It's because it has the word social more, so then people would kind of focus more on the social everyday aspects of life. But of course, these are not very theorized and rationalized. I recently, for example, I am contributing to, I don't know, it's called the Oxford Companion to and they reuse the word communism. So the editors, okay. So they use the communist visual culture, I think it's called. And I'm writing an essay there as well, right? And I asked the editor, so why are you using the word communism? Because honestly, in this particular moment of my career, I feel uncomfortable with it, because it sounds so much like the old days of Radio Free Europe or whatever. And she would say, well, and she gave me she wrote to me, the editor, 2 pages of argument, why should we use it? Well, so it was an argument. It was believable. I would agree with it, no. But that was the point. So I think we should. There's the battle over words. Sometimes it also has an ideological background, right? Now, to anti-communism as a discourse. So, did that have a negative effect on how we remember socialism? Absolutely yes. Terrible. Because so many things have been attributed to communism that were just bad state governance, or they were, I don't know, just typical of the underdevelopment of East Central Europe. Communism was used as a scapegoat for many other things that, because they have not been brought in the public discourse, because they have been just labeled as communist and thrown at the trash can of history, they keep haunting the present.
Do we have any comments and questions? Yeah.
Thank you for this presentation. I wonder all the time, have you examined or investigated research on the difference between Central Eastern European cinematic representation on the past and Eastern European? And the direct question, does the Ukraine and Ukrainian cinematic history representation fits in your general concepts? And is it different? And I would be grateful if you could elaborate on that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point. Of course, we come back to words, to the way we use the concepts. I mean, there has been sometimes Central Europe. I mean, of course, I'm doing here like genealogy of terms, right? So Central Europe has been used very often as, to say where Zizek's, where is the Balkan? Okay, the Balkan is always the east of where I am, right? So then, of course, Central Europe was a way also used sometimes prerogatively to marginalize cultures like Bulgaria or Romania or whatever, because there was, let's say, a more progressive cultural matrix in other countries like Poland, Hungary, Central Europe. Okay? So then Central Europe was also like one of the terms that, you know, has been a bit used, overused, and then has kind of lost faith. Of course, we don't go back to Central Europe and as a term that was used Mitteleuropa as, you know, kind of German imperialist term, so I don't even want to go there anymore, right? So, and then when you say Eastern Europe, the way I use it in my book, for example, in Eastern Europe, okay, in Orphans of the East, I used Eastern Europe as a, let's say, territory, you know, as a political experience of socialism, right, or communist, or Soviet-style communism, I would say, put it this way. And Eastern Europe was all countries that have gone through it, but in my particular case, for limitations of knowledge, like, I don't speak the languages. I mean, I speak a few languages, but I don't, so my knowledge of Russian, Ukrainian, and so on, you know, is close to zero. I studied only what they call the satellite states, right? So then it was Eastern Europe as an experience of socialism in general, but especially of the small nations that were, let's say, exposed to the superpower of the Soviet Union. But I would not differentiate between East Central Europe or Central Europe and Eastern Europe as the Ukraine, right? I would say for me, it's like, this is more part of the Soviet history, right? And not of the countries outside the Soviet Union. So that would be my opposition in my way of analyzing the region. And of course, it's cinematic production. We might not be on the same page, I understand, but this is my methodology.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So, Constantin, thank you very much for your stimulating lecture. Let's applaud once more.